Now, we've previously discussed the research led by British lawyer Trevor Asserson, which found that the BBC breached its own editorial guidelines for news coverage more than 1,500 times during the height of the Israel-Hamas war. Israel was associated with genocide 14 times more than Hamas, who carried out the mass terrorist attacks against Israelis on October 7. The BBC's Arabic channel was found to be one of the most biased of all global media outlets against Israel, with 11 instances in which their coverage featured reporters who publicly supported Hamas. Joining me now is senior partner at the Asserson Law Offices, Trevor Asserson. Trevor, is the BBC institutionally anti-Semitic? What is behind these breaches of editorial guidelines?
I think what's really behind these breaches, and they're systemic breaches, is a total management failure to control the journalists at the BBC. So I've not suggested that there's anti-Semitism. I've deliberately avoided doing that because it's not my concern to look at the motives behind individuals or the organisation. What I've looked at is systemic breaches of the BBC's own guidelines to be impartial. And the reason behind it really is that the BBC itself, although it has a deal with the British people, it will receive £4 billion a year, in return for which it promises to give impartial news. But they have absolutely no management controls at all in place to check whether or not they actually do it. That's, I think, the fundamental problem behind what's going on.
Well, these editorial guideline breaches by the BBC included all sorts of areas: accuracy, impartiality, editorial values, public interest. You mentioned that they're publicly funded. Our own publicly funded broadcaster, the ABC here in Australia, has a similar worldview to the BBC. In your experience, are taxpayer-funded broadcasters more likely to indulge in this sort of unrelentingly biased coverage against Israel?
I think that public sector broadcasters are as likely as any other news outlets to be captured by a particular viewpoint. The people within the senior management will tend to hire people who they think to be right-thinking, who think like them, and those people will tend to be hired and be promoted. It's very difficult for a public sector broadcaster to be impartial, or for any broadcaster to be impartial, unless it has very careful, proper management systems in place. The BBC absolutely doesn't. I've been approached by Australians concerned with the Australian public sector broadcaster, and I believe that there are serious problems there as well. I think what's really at stake is that some journalists who clearly have very, very negative views should not be just allowed they should be sent to something more harmless, like Gardner's Question Time, where they can do less harm. And they shouldn't be reporting on something where they are clearly using the platform to express their own personal views. And the guidelines say, we will not express our journalists' personal views. Well, that's a myth. It's been exploded by my report. And that it's that kind of breach. Another type of absolutely clear breach is that Hamas is a dictatorship that controls the reporting that comes out of Gaza Strip. And the BBC specifically states that whenever they're reporting from somewhere with reporting restrictions, they'll tell the audience. They never tell the audience that. They allow these people to report as though what they're telling is the truth, which it clearly isn't. And they know, the BBC knows it isn't the truth. They've got an obligation to say so, they fail.